So thanks for joining us today, everybody. Thanks for sitting in here in the boiling weather and listening to a talk about social media. My name's Mahon. I'm going to be talking about this question: is social media bad for our mental health? I do say "our" because I include myself in this. According to my screen time, I unlocked my phone 421 times this week. That is once every 22 minutes, for those who can do maths. Whenever I unlock my phone, I do the same thing, which is that I go to WhatsApp, see if there's any messages. I go to Facebook Messenger. I go to Instagram. I go to Facebook. I go to LinkedIn. Maybe if I'm really desperate, I check the emails. But the point is that I'm doing this every 22 minutes without really thinking about it, without consciously deciding to actually check my phone. It's already in my hand. If I can get to the next slide. And this is me. I'm studying the ethical issues of social media, and I can't stop using it, which is not very good. Maybe you guys are better. Maybe you're all perfect and brilliant with social media. I don't know if you are. But I suspect a lot of other people are in the same boat as me and have a hard time dealing with this technology. I received a scholarship from DCU's School of Theology and Philosophy to study the ethical issues of social media, which I will be starting in September. One of the key issues with social media is the relationship with mental health, mainly anxiety, eating disorders, and depression. So that's what we're going to talk about in this. I'm going to look at some of the current research on social media, the relationship with addiction, and then some stuff that we can all do to make it better. So at the moment, the relationship with social media and mental health is quite controversial. There is a debate in the academic literature, surprise, surprise, when they can't really get on about anything. But the main issue is about, how much is it affecting people? Is it how much you use it? Is it using it at all? That's the problem. But we are learning more and more that there is enough evidence to strongly indicate that it is a problem for people. So I'm going to go through some of the studies that have been reported so far. This first one is that the greater level of Facebook addiction, the lower your brain volume. MRI brain scans of Facebook users demonstrated a significant reduction in grey matter in the amygdala correlated with their level of addiction to Facebook. This pruning away of brain matter is similar to the type of cell death seen in cocaine addicts. I know what you're thinking, ooh, gross, Facebook, but this was done in 2017 when people still used it. So a lack of grey matter, what that does essentially is it causes a loss of cognitive functioning. It can lead to motor function issues, losing control of fine motor skills, similar to the type of uncontrollable shaking that we see in Parkinson's disease. This next one, if I can click onto it, which is eating disorders. The more time you spend on Instagram, the more likely you are to suffer eating disorders such as orthorexia nervosa. According to research, no other social media platforms have this correlative effect, and Instagram's algorithm recommendations allow orthorexia sufferers to become trapped in an echo chamber of images that only show a distorted reality of food images and how to react to food. This is one of the most common complaints about social media, really, is the issues around anorexia, orthorexia, which is kind of an obsession with purity and eating pure foods, which is different to anorexia, to be fair. This was what was released by the Facebook whistleblower. You might have heard of Frances Haugen. Frances Haugen worked for Facebook and leaked essentially all of their internal documents, which showed that Facebook, in an internal study, had done research that 13.5% of teen girls said Instagram makes thoughts of suicide worse, and 17% of teen girls said it makes eating disorders worse. Frances Haugen testified that Facebook knows that they are leading young users to anorexia content. It's just like cigarettes. Teenagers don't have any self-regulation. We need to protect the kids. She also said what's super tragic is Facebook's own research says these young women begin to consume this eating disorder content. They get more and more depressed, and it actually makes them use the app more. They end up in a feedback cycle where they hate their bodies more and more, and Facebook didn't care. And this one also, similar issue, that the number of likes on a celebrity Instagram account can significantly change how you see yourself. An experimental study showed that when women were exposed to different celebrity Instagram images, their ratings of their own facial appearance dropped in direct proportion to the number of likes attached to each image they saw. Which is really sad, because you think how often that people use Instagram and how typically we just log onto it and don't really think too much about it. But even without putting stuff up, it's affecting your self-image. It's affecting social comparisons and just really what you think about yourself, which I think is very tragic. This one's interesting because I think this happened to me and probably a few other people in this room, which is that posting alcohol-related messages on Facebook can lead to an increase in alcoholic behavior and alcoholic identity in real life. Research analysis of several hundred college students revealed that the more they posted alcohol-related messages, the more their real-life social groups tended to shift a few months later towards friends with higher alcohol use, which then in turn linked to an increase in their own levels of drinking a few months after that. I'm not a doctor, but I do know excessive binge drinking is not good for mental health. It is also an interesting point that you can get shoehorned for the content that you put up. If you put up something and it's successful, you're more likely to post again and again that type of content. And in that way, it can change your personality and your character. I've heard it said that social media is the largest unregulated experiment ever performed in human social engineering. So this is a very important study that just came out, which has been done from 2003 to 2018. It's a longitudinal study, and it was done with children and adolescents from the ages of 1 to 20. You can see here on it that the rates of self-harm in young women nearly doubled between 2011 and 2013. This is also the same in the US, which is a hockey stick curve. And American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt argues the rise in self-harm is directly related to social media, because at this time, Facebook introduced the like and share buttons, Twitter introduced the retweet share features, and introduced new levels of social validation, which particularly damaged young women, as we'll see in the next slide as well. So you can see here the increase in anxiety over time also had been steadily increasing, but increased quite massively around the same period. Eating disorders and depression also increasing in boys, but at a lower rate, as social media seems to have a disproportionate effect on young women, according to the literature. So the end result of this long-term study was that there's a mounting body of evidence for a dose-response relationship between social media usage and poor mental health outcomes. Greater social media use has been linked to online harassment, sleep deficits, low self-esteem, poor body image, which are associated with an increased risk for developing depression, anxiety disorders, and eating disorders. This idea of a dose response is quite important. That kind of uses the example of, say, sugar, which is that if you eat a small amount of sugar, it's okay, but if you eat loads of sugar, you get diabetes and you get sick. A lot of people don't agree with that with social media. Because it uses a lot of gambling technology, it's kind of like saying a little bit of gambling is okay for kids rather than, a lot. So that's also quite controversial in the literature. What I really think the issue with mental health and social media comes down to is addiction. For me, it's pretty obvious that social media is addictive, and probably for many of you that have used it and found it's pretty hard to get off of. I was listening to a podcast the other day, though, with Blind Boy Boat Club, and he had a cyber psychologist on that actually said that social media wasn't addictive. And I've been thinking about it ever since, because I just couldn't believe that somebody would actually make that statement who's a professional. It's kind of like saying loads of dopamine isn't addictive, when that's essentially what addiction is. So it's a really ignorant statement. I won't name names. I can't remember her name, so I won't. But so Dr. Anna Lemke, who's an addiction specialist, she's also the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She's a best-selling author of Dopamine Nation. I was lucky enough to have her on my podcast recently, where we spoke about this exact issue. And Dr. Lemke says that dopamine or social media is addictive because it's engineered to reinforce use, so people come back and use it more and more. And it's also engineered to provide more than normal levels of dopamine in the brain. As she says, At the end of the day, social media feels good while we're doing it and horrible as soon as we stop. It makes us feel crappy because it plunges us into a dopamine deficit state as our brains attempt to adapt to the unnaturally high levels of dopamine that it releases. So a lot of this comes down to dopamine. Dopamine is pretty important. Dopamine is the molecule of motivation, drive, and pursuit. It also obeys the rule of what goes up must come down. So for every time you have an increase in dopamine, you have a mirror-symmetric decrease as well. So if you have, say, a large peak of dopamine, your body compensates and goes down below base level, which we'll talk about in a second because it's important for social media. Essentially, what social media does, this is a long-term study on dopamine and social media addiction. Social media piggybacks on other social rewards like status, validation, desirability. As this says, getting texts, likes, or messages are intrinsically rewarding. They evoke feelings of happiness and satisfaction due to the virtual social life that social media platforms mimic. However, these feelings are only temporary, and once the initial short-lived moment wears off, individuals look for more. This is kind of how you end up in a feedback loop. Social media uses the same technology as gambling, which is why your news feed works by pulling down and then loading and then showing you content. It doesn't actually have to do that. It does that because it allows you time to anticipate a reward, which has your dopamine neurons in your brain firing and then keeps them active. So in gambling, if you're playing on a machine in a casino, there's that intense anticipatory period. Say when you pull the lever and then the dopamine neurons are very active. But if you then lose, your dopamine levels die off. You become disheartened, you lose again. Pretty soon you'll just give up because you just get bored. So what they do in gambling is that you lose, and then you win. It's called intermittent reinforcement, random intermittent reinforcement. So you lose, and then you win, and then winning keeps you engaged for longer. Interestingly, you can do this to all mammals. So they do it to monkeys, they do it to mice. They do it to monkeys, they do it to mice. So if you have a rat and you reward it every time it pulls a lever, the rat will stop pulling the lever after a certain amount of time. But if you reward the rat every second time, every fifth time, every eighth time, intermittently, it will keep pulling the lever indefinitely. So this is what's happening to us with social media. It's called reward prediction error. So again, if you think about roulette, you throw all the money on, a lot of the fun is watching it go round and round and round, and then bam, you win. But if you don't, if somebody just wins, if it was 100% of the time and you anticipated winning, it wouldn't really be that interesting. A guy called Dr. Wolfram Schultz figured out that we have a thing called reward prediction error, which is that if you anticipate a reward and you get a reward, you get a little bit of dopamine. If you don't anticipate a reward and you get a reward, you get a lot of dopamine. And if you anticipate a reward and you don't get one, you actually fall below baseline. So if you think about it, like imagine your friend comes to you and says, there's going to be a big night out and it's going to be the best party of all time and it's going to be lit. And then you get there and it sucks and it's terrible. You've actually gone down below baseline with that. Whereas if you go out during the day after work, you don't have any expectations, it's kind of chill, and then you end up having the best time ever. And you're like, holy shit, that was awesome. That was because you had no expectations. And it turns out that's key for the dopamine system. So social media functions by leveraging reward prediction error and providing intermittent rewards to users to reinforce their behavior, like my searching through the apps that I talked about at the start to find a notification or a message or something else that's rewarding. So how does social media work? Social media keeps you engaged with these four methods. Fundamentally, algorithmic recommendations build a model of you and try and predict what you're going to do next. If you've seen The Social Dilemma, they do it with like a bunch of guys in a room kind of like trying to figure you out and guess what you're going to do. It's quite pernicious, and they're probably the most advanced supercomputers that anybody's ever made, and they're being used to try and sell us stuff. There's a bit of a conspiracy theory that the algorithms have gotten so good that they're changing us into the type of people that will consume the content rather than just recommending the content to us, which might be interesting in the future if that's actually happening. Social dynamics, game dynamics, obviously it levers like status, competition, popularity, images of highly curated people, influencers that establish standards of excellence that nobody can match up to. And these all activate powerful reward circuits in the brain, and also just cause us to compare ourselves to people all the time, which is pretty depressing, because comparison is the thief of joy, as they say. Negativity. Social media weaponizes negativity because we've evolved to be more sensitive to negative stimuli than positive stimuli, because if there's a lion in the bush, you're way more screwed than you are if it's just a mouse, so you're more likely to be frightened of it. But this leads to competition where every single news story has to be worse and worse. There has to be a bigger crisis after every crisis, because even the apocalypse gets kind of boring when you're on the internet all the time. The hacking of evolutionary drives, that's kind of what we've spoken about this whole time, really. We're evolved animals and we have these kind of weaknesses with our neurochemicals, with the things we find salient. The reason notifications are red is because we evolved to see fruit in the forest, in the jungle. So people have put a lot of thought into this, into keeping us engaged. So is social media addictive? Social media is engineered to provide larger than normal hits of dopamine at irregular intervals to keep you coming back. The mechanisms of the app program us to anticipate reward and hence unconsciously reinforce using behavior. The universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive drug are anxiety, insomnia, irritability, and depression, which you might recognize as some of the core symptoms of mental health problems. Dr. Anna Lemke, who I had on the podcast, says that a vast majority of young people's mental health problems are to do with these issues of addiction, be it from video games, social media, what have you. Anything that's high in dopamine can cause a dopamine deficiency. So enough of the depressing stuff. I think that's more depressing stuff because it's increasing. What can we do about it? I like to be useful and pragmatic if I can whenever I'm doing any of my work, and give people actual things that they can do in their own lives to try and take the edge off this a little bit. Obviously, social media requires infrastructural change. Sorry, Corky, can you turn that phone off, please? Yeah? Good man. Try and do a speech here. If you want to take it, you can go outside. But yeah. So it's going to require legal reformation. It's at the moment very slow because the technology is so complicated and new. But in the meantime, a lot of people are suffering and a lot of people are falling into very bad habits with it. So the question is, what can we do about it? It's very unsexy advice, but to fix a dopamine imbalance, you need 30 days of abstinence from your drug of choice, whatever it is. During this time, it becomes possible to notice the dependency on it. You'll notice thoughts in your mind saying, hey, check that app. Why don't you have a look at Facebook, see what's going on Instagram? And you can become aware of the fact that it actually has its hooks in you, which is very difficult when you're using it all the time. Because of the type of technology that it is, there might be very little way to control your relationship with it, aside from taking regular breaks and putting checks and balances in place. There's no fancy fix to this one, unfortunately. It just kind of has to suck for a while, which is unfortunate. But self-binding strategies, which would be putting obstacles in the way of you using it. I have a K-safe, what's called a kitchen safe, which is just a kitchen safe timer, and you can put your phone in it for 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and get it out of harm's way for a period of time. Which might be the best way, because I don't know about you, but every time I have it in my hand, I'm probably going to open it. So it's better to just get it out of the way. Also monitoring metrics, what I did at the start, checking your screen time, checking how much you're opening it up, and just deciding how much do you want to use it really at the end of the day. There are also some meta apps called Moment, App Detox, Off Time, which kind of make your phone a bit shitter, so it's less enjoyable. They just kind of take away all the good stuff from it, but if it works. And yeah, this is kind of the main point. I mean, long-term goals, why are you using social media? Why are any of us using it? I started the majority of my social media when I was 25 to start sharing things online, to do my blog, to do my podcast. And in that time, I've really gotten very involved in it. But My plan is not to do that forever, because I think these technologies are harmful to people that use them unconsciously, and that they're changing our relationships to ourselves and our relationships to other people. So it's important to set goals and constraints and think about how you really want to use them, rather than just sleepwalking with this technology. So I wanted to end with a quote by Robert Greene, who's a philosophy author. He said, "In the future, the great division will be between those who have trained themselves to handle these complexities and those who are overwhelmed by them. Those who can acquire skills and discipline their minds, and those who are irrevocably distracted by all the media around them and can never focus enough to learn." In my opinion, social media is part of a much bigger problem in the 21st century. The problem is that reward is now decoupled from effort, so we can get pleasure without expending any effort to do so. Naturally, as animals, we seek pleasure and avoid pain, but part of maturing and growing up is being able to endure pain to get real rewards. We now have to make this decision voluntarily ourselves, which has never been the case before in human history. And we need a culture and leaders who encourage us to overcome cheap pleasures and to face honourable pains, to grow and develop ourselves as people, and to function well as a human being, which is what well-being really means. There are these two paths in the future, and it's up to you which one you choose. Thanks for your attention. I need to go outside, it's too hot. What time is it? Yeah, I have another few minutes. If anybody had any questions or anything, thoughts, feelings, wants to throw things at me, I can dodge quite well.
I just wondered, Matthew, you talked a lot about there on your own personal responsibility in relation to social media. But where is the onus of responsibility and accountability with the social media? People who generate social media, the owner of Instagram.
It's a very good question, to be honest. I would say the onus is very much on them, but they have proven largely, particularly in the case of Facebook, that they're not really interested in changing it. They did suppress all of the information that they had about their own reports of what it was doing to young women and eating disorders. And so there's a big question about whether or not these companies are reliable stewards of their own technology. The incentives also are really bad, which is that they're competing with, say, TikTok, with Netflix, with Snapchat, with Instagram, and they're all competing for a finite amount of attention. Netflix actually said once that their biggest rival was sleep, which kind of shows the mindset. So there's the incentive structure, which is a big complaint really about the attention economy in general, is that human attention is finite and there's more and more companies trying to take it over, essentially. So I don't know, we can't control those companies without regulation from the government. And that's something that's kind of ongoing, really. Don?
This is probably a tricky question, but is there any sense that we are adapting to this technology?
Yeah.
Learning to live with it more?
Yeah.
Or that it's just continuing to becoming more and more destructive with the introduction of more and more addictive apps?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be different ones seem to have different effects on people. Like, say, LinkedIn doesn't seem to have the same effects on eating disorders or things like that. So there is gradients to it. Ones that have more predatory business models, like TikTok, is just like a nightmare. Like the way they've calibrated their algorithm essentially is to grab your attention as aggressively as possible. So it does depend on the app itself. Like, some ones don't have the same damage. Other ones are a bit more controversial. I kind of pointed out the conspiracy theory angle that there's a chance that the algorithms are training us to be better consumers of content rather than us training algorithms. There is that kind of idea that you train the algorithm to give you the content that you want, but we don't really know. It's very new, so there's still a lot of questions about what the long-term effects are going to be. In the last 20 years, I think it's really damaged people, particularly young women. Young men seem to have more problems with like YouTube and video games, which are also can be very destructive. But particularly for young women, it has been very disastrous for their mental health. So yeah, it's still unfolding. Corey?
Any organisation out there that's regulating what you're saying about the links between basically being addicted to social media and what's the progression, and is there any type of organisations out there that are key what you're exactly explaining at the moment? Or?
Yeah, I mean, the UK just put through a duty of care bill, so that's putting some restrictions on it. There was also a Supreme Court hearing in America with the Facebook whistleblower, which is discussing putting restrictions for kids, because Instagram were originally going to launch an Instagram for kids, specifically aimed at kids, until that came out, and they put it on the back burner because it was a bit of a PR nightmare for them. So yeah, there is some tentative regulation. Germany has some as well. The problem is they're really complicated technologies, and so it's not clear exactly which bit of them is harmful and which bit isn't. And they've also become essential parts of the economy. I don't know if you remember when Facebook went down for those 2 days, like you could barely get out of bed. Like there was we had to cancel our training and like organize and stuff. So it's difficult to regulate something when so many people are using it and when it has such economies of scale in the market.
The laws of regulating social media affect the laws of human rights and personal speech.
Yeah, I mean, something I kind of joke about is like we need a bill of animal rights for humans, because we do have an evolved nature, and if technology has gotten so good that companies can just hack people to make them customers, that's going to be a real problem. That's not ethical in my eyes anyway. That kind of disturbs the free market principle that people are consuming things voluntarily. If desires are being implanted in them or they're being manipulated, like they say, like nobody's goal is to maximize their time on Facebook. Nobody wants to spend the most time, but that's Facebook's goal every time you open the app. And the same with TikTok. So there's a conflict there, a conflict of interest between people. But I think we will probably in the next 10 years see some sort of regulation. The problem is new companies can come along, like TikTok, and TikTok's making money. TikTok has made 60 billion, I think, since it first started, which is much more than, say, Twitter or YouTube or anything in the beginning. So there's a lot of incentive for companies to race to the bottom of the brainstem and to get people addicted to whatever content they're selling, unfortunately. Anybody else?
I see a lot of people in the room here that I think are, I suppose, the first generation of people who had, the Bebo,
Yeah.
and then went on to all the other apps,
Yeah.
and I suppose mobile phones. So do you think, like, what you're saying essentially is, it has potential for like mass brainwashing?
Yeah, it has. I mean, there's been a lot of side effects and things with, say, children that have been exposed to screens too much, not being able to read, having worse comprehension, not being able to recognize people's facial features and having to be retrained. Even in college students, what it seems to damage, I mean, if you think about it, we have a finite amount of time. So if you're now dedicating, however screen time, 5-6 hours, that's time when you're not looking at people. That's time when you're not learning about how people act, how they treat each other. And for young people, that time is very vital. It's kind of okay if you've come through that and you're out the other side, but developmentally, we really don't know what it's doing at all. And it doesn't seem to be great, but it's already happening. So I don't know if you could stop it. We just need to figure out ways of regulating it, I think. Anybody else? No? Sweet. Well, thank you very much. You can join me on Substack as well. This is my attempt to get off of social media. So Substack is essentially an independent newsletter company where you communicate by email rather than social media platforms. So that's also one for trying to get away from the more toxic stuff. But thank you very much.